My sister made middle school a nightmare. She spread rumors, stole my crush, and somehow turned family dinners into comedy nights where I was always the punchline. Now, years later, she needs a kidney transplant. And guess whose name is at the top of the donor list? Mine. But here's the kicker. When I finally gave in to the testing just to quiet everyone down, the results revealed something no one expected. It wasn't just about kidneys. Let's just say my sister's cruelty didn't start with her illness. It started way back on the playground. The queen of playground bullying. Back in grade school, Alicia didn't just blend into the crowd. She practically ran the place. Teachers saw a charismatic kid who made other students laugh. What I saw was someone who treated every classroom and every recess like her own stage, and I was usually the material. It started with how she weaponized things only a sibling could know. One time, I confided in her about how much my stuffed animal meant to me. Not long after, it ripped open at the seam. Instead of helping me quietly fix it, Alicia scooped up the stuffing, marched into show and tell, and held it up like a trophy. My classmates doubled over laughing while I sat there burning with shame. Even now, when I think back, I realize moments like that are why trust between us didn't survive into adulthood. Another memory that still stings happened in 5th grade. My music teacher gave me a solo in the school concert, and for once, I actually felt proud. I sang, nervous but holding my own, until my voice cracked. I didn't even need to glance at Alicia in the audience to know she was smirking. She whispered just loud enough for others to hear about the time I'd once bungled the lyrics to a TV jingle at home. That single mistake became a punchline she nursed for years. Looking back, it wasn't just about public embarrassment. It was the crushing reminder that no accomplishment of mine would ever escape her sabotage. The part that cut the deepest wasn't the laughter from classmates, but the way she orchestrated it. Alicia didn't just stand by while others teased me. She fueled it. She slipped bullies personal details I never wanted shared, like my private crushes or the way I still used a nightlight. With that kind of ammunition, she armed them to hit me where it hurt most. It felt like being ganged up on by both peers and the sibling who was supposed to have my back. For a kid, that kind of betrayal doesn't just sting, it reshapes how you see family. Some people like to chalk that up to sibling rivalry. But rivalry suggests competition. What I endured was something else entirely. If rivalry is stealing the bigger slice of cake, what she did was turning every awkward moment of my childhood into a one-person roast. It stopped being a game when I realized there was no safe place. Home and school did together into one ongoing spotlight where I was always the butt of the joke, and Alicia relished it. Other kids might playfully tease siblings, then pivot to defending them against outsiders. Alicia? She was the ringleader. If teasing was a group project, she was the loud leader presenting the slides, and I was the case study getting torn apart. The sad irony is that I grew up envying kids who had those stereotypical older siblings who scared bullies off in the hallway. Mine was busy handing them strategies. The fallout of her behavior didn't fade when the bell rang. Emotional scars like those don't pack up at dismissal, they follow you. I became hesitant to share myself with anyone, convinced any vulnerability could turn into material to be used against me. Even now, traces of that anxiety linger. When someone laughs a little too loudly at my expense, I feel an old familiar knot in my chest. It's almost laughable now how two-faced she managed to be. At school, she wore the crown of the funny, charismatic girl. At home, she paraded her greatest hits like a comedian rehearsing a set, embellishing details for maximum effect at the dinner table. Relatives would chuckle. Sometimes even my parents joined in. Those moments left me frozen at family gatherings, wishing someone in that room would notice I wasn't laughing. That pattern, her antics played as entertainment while my discomfort went ignored, cemented my place in the shadows of our family dynamic. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if my parents had entertained even once the idea that maybe Alicia was crossing a line. But they didn't. They leaned on the easier story. Alicia's just playful. Don't be so sensitive. Their refusal to take me seriously only magnified her power. When the people meant to protect you laugh along, you learn quickly that speaking up changes nothing. There are researchers who talk about sibling bullying as carrying many of the same long-term effects as peer bullying. Anxiety, depression, self-doubt carried well into adulthood. Hearing that validated everything. The erosion of trust, the lingering sense of being unsafe in places meant to be safe. It wasn't me being overdramatic, it was real damage. Of course, her behavior didn't stop at schoolyard antics or the occasional performance sabotage. Alicia developed an instinct for timing, for choosing moments when humiliation would land hardest. And nowhere was that more obvious than at home. When the spotlight shifted from childhood games to the family dinner table, that's where her comedic streak found its biggest audience, and where I learned that even in my own house, there was no break from being her favorite punchline. Family dinners as comedy roasts. At dinner, the plates didn't matter nearly as much as the performance unfolding around them. Alicia thrived on turning mealtimes into her own comedy routine, and the table was her stage. Every clang of a fork or scrape of a chair felt like a drum roll, and I dreaded who she'd target next. Most nights, it was me. She didn't waste opportunities. If a dish didn't look perfect, she swooped in. I remember the night my mom tried a casserole from a magazine. It came out pale and lumpy, with noodles poking through like they were trying to escape. Alicia stabbed her fork into it, held the spoonful aloft, and declared, "Presenting tonight's special. Beige disaster with a side of shame." Laughter erupted. My dad nearly choked on his own food, and my mom laughed along too, though I caught her eyes harden for a second before she blinked it away. I sat still, pretending to eat while my stomach twisted. All I wanted was to slide under the table until everyone forgot I was there. School wasn't off limits either. Report cards especially were loaded ammunition. The time I brought home a B in science, I hadn't even taken a bite before Alicia launched her act. She cleared her throat, clasped her hands like she was preaching, and said, "Let us all grieve. My sibling's future career has officially peaked, assistant to a microwave repairman." My parents laughed harder than they should have. I stared at my plate, pushing spaghetti around. The joke stung, but my parents' reaction hurt more. Their laughter told me I shouldn't feel insulted, I should feel entertained. That was the real problem. Alicia's words landed sharper because they came with a safety net. My parents. They didn't scold her or draw a line. They chuckled and treated her cruel jokes like natural background noise at the dinner table. In that moment, it became clear, if the people you look to for protection laugh at your humiliation, then your pain becomes invisible. The rhythm at dinner was predictable. Alicia got her set up, delivered the punchline, and paused while the table laughed. I knew my next comment, outfit, or even the way I chewed could turn into her next gag. On the surface, it seemed harmless, just jokes bouncing around the table. To me, it felt like I was on stage without agreeing to be there. That kind of cycle takes its toll. I stopped volunteering stories about my day because anything I said became fuel. I avoided eye contact, hoping invisibility would shield me. But silence only gave her more room to lean in. And the more she embarrassed me, the more people thought she was funny. At 11 years old, I started excusing myself early under the pretense of homework. Upstairs, I'd press my ear to the vent, listening to the muffled roar of laughter below. Even after I was gone, she managed to keep me in the room by making me a character in her ongoing routine. It wasn't just meals. Holidays amplified it. With relatives gathered, she escalated her act like she'd been saving material just for them. My cousins cheered her on as she mimicked me tripping on stairs or exaggerated a wrong answer I once gave in class. They laughed like they had all paid for seats at the show. I stared down at my plate, wishing the clatter of dishes was loud enough to swallow her voice. Over time, those dinners rewired how I felt about sitting at a table with my family. Normal families seemed to talk quietly, asking about each other's days. Ours didn't. Ours wrapped sarcasm around every exchange and called it humor. Sitting there was like paying for a comedy show where the cost was pride, and I was always the one footing the bill. The cruelest part wasn't Alicia herself, it was the chorus of laughter ensuring her words landed. People say siblings tease, that it's normal. But what I experienced wasn't rivalry or playful banter. It was a hierarchy. She took the role of entertainer, and I was assigned the role of joke. My parents' approval only cemented that stage. And when your own family validates the person tearing you down, you learn quickly that your feelings don't carry weight. Fighting back didn't work. The one or two comebacks I mustered crumbled under her timing. If I snapped, my parents told me to lighten up. If I sulked, I was called dramatic. It didn't matter what I did. In their eyes, I wasn't being bullied, I just didn't have a sense of humor. That was the line they repeated. And nothing makes you feel smaller than being told the problem isn't what someone's doing. It's who you are. What accumulated over years of these roasts wasn't just shame. It was resentment layered meal after meal. I began to associate the sound of cutlery and the smell of food with dread, because no matter what conversation started, it would find its way back to me. Hearing my name wasn't acknowledgement. It was the announcement to brace for the next punchline. That resentment hardened quietly. It stuck around when I walked into restaurants and saw other families eating in calm silence. It followed me when I sat at friends' houses where dinner was about sharing food, not weaponizing it. I envied something simple, a table that didn't feel like a stage. And in envying it, I realized how much I'd lost. By the time I left for college, I carried that loss like luggage. Those dinners had trained me to assume that vulnerability was something to be laughed at, not respected. Trust felt fragile. Sharing a story about myself felt like handing someone an open invitation to cut me down. And though I was determined to start over, the past had already left its mark. College gave me a chance to breathe, to step into a place where no one knew the old family scripts and where meals weren't a guaranteed humiliation. For the first time, I thought maybe I'd get the reset I had craved. New people, new routines, new air. I didn't realize how quickly the patterns from home could sneak back into my life. This time not at the dinner table, but with someone I let close. And that's where the real fracture with Alicia took a turn I never could have predicted. The boyfriend betrayal. When I first started dating in college, it felt like I had stepped into unfamiliar but welcome territory. For once, I was free to decide who I spent time with, without worrying that Alicia would twist things into another opportunity to get a laugh at my expense. Meeting Will felt like finding someone who lived outside the constant drama of my family. He was steady. He listened when I talked instead of waiting for his turn to take a jab. He didn't make me feel like entertainment. For a while, I thought I'd found something untouched by the kind of cruelty I'd grown up around. Bringing him home, though, was the real test. I wasn't nervous about my parents or whether he'd impress at the table. What I worried about was Alicia. And sure enough, she wasted no time turning his first visit into something entirely about her. While my parents made casual small talk, Alicia leaned across the table like she was auditioning. She laughed a second too long at his mildest jokes, brushed his arm when no one was looking, and jumped into answering questions directed at me before I could speak. If he asked about my classes, she told a story instead, usually one that left me squirming. By dessert, it was clear he hadn't met my family that night. He'd been introduced to my sister's performance. At first, I tried to rationalize it as her usual behavior. She had always needed the spotlight, and stealing the focus from me was nothing new. But this time felt pointed. Her eyes lingered too long, her voice softened when she spoke to him. It wasn't about me anymore, it was about him. I told myself I was imagining things. Who openly flirts with their sister's boyfriend the first night they meet? But little signals started to pile up. I'd call Will, only to find he was already on another call, later learning it had been with her. He started showing up late to our plans, distracted, glancing at his phone with an expression I recognized but couldn't place. Inside jokes cropped up between them, jokes I wasn't a part of. At first, the confusion gnawed at me more than the jealousy. How could they share things I wasn't even aware existed? Then came the moment that stripped away all denial. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. I wasn't snooping. Her phone lit up on the counter one evening, and his name flashed across the screen. I shouldn't have looked, but my eyes caught more than just a name. The thread of their messages scrolled upward, obvious in tone, too intimate to mistake for playful banter. Everything from late-night meetings to suggestive emojis spelled it out. There was no hiding what had been going on right under my nose. Seeing it laid out, that directly felt like being shoved into ice water. My chest tightened, and I gripped the counter just to steady myself. I wanted to deny it until the very last second. I wanted to believe there was some context missing or a reason that might lessen the blow. When I confronted Will, I actually gave him the room to come clean properly, to explain. Instead, he stumbled, tried to minimize things, claimed it looked worse than it was. That line fell apart quickly. The truth spilled out in bits and pieces. He and Alicia had been texting for weeks. They'd met up on their own, and what happened between them wasn't just conversation. I should have been angry enough on its own, but the way Alicia treated it made it worse. When I confronted her, she didn't flinch. No guilt, no shame. She smirked like she'd pulled off a clever trick. She even bragged, hinting that it was nothing new, that I shouldn't be surprised she had won again. That wasn't just betrayal. It was her relishing the destruction she caused. And that confirmed what I'd felt my whole life. If there was something I cared about, she would make it her target. The hurt came from both sides. Will's betrayal broke my trust in someone outside the family, but Alicia's complete lack of remorse cut deeper. It told me that any part of my life I tried to build, no matter how far I thought I'd gotten from her, she would find a way to take. That night marked the point where distance wasn't enough. I realized I couldn't simply move away from her shadow. The only option left was to cut her out completely. What made the situation sting years later was knowing Alicia didn't just treat Will like another conquest. She kept him. They went on to form a relationship out of what started as her breaking mine. I'll mention later what eventually became of him, but at the time, the knowledge alone felt like salt in the wound. That betrayal was the final straw. Everything else, the mocking, dinner table ridicule, even the way she supplied bullies with ammunition, those things bruised me. But stealing the one safe corner I thought I had carved for myself broke something I couldn't piece back together. By then, my decision to separate myself wasn't about pettiness or rivalry anymore. It was survival. Cutting ties wasn't simple, though. As much as I wanted to walk away, family doesn't let you disappear without questions. And when I tried to explain what happened, to get anyone, to see what Alicia had done, I met resistance I should have expected. Because in my family, Alicia was never wrong. And saying otherwise felt like speaking into a void dressed up with polite smiles. Family Gaslighting 101. Trying to explain what Alicia had done to me was always an uphill fight, but the harder part wasn't even her. It was my parents. Every conversation ended the same way, with them brushing off my words like lint off a sleeve. No matter how careful I was in laying out the details, they defaulted to defending her. Mom in particular became almost rehearsed at it, shaking her head before I was through speaking, as if my version couldn't possibly be true. Dad didn't argue much, but when he did bother, it was usually with something dismissive like, "She probably didn't mean it." It felt less like I was confiding in parents and more like I was sitting across from lawyers determined to get their star client acquitted. The message sank in quickly. Alicia's cruelty wasn't cruelty at all. It was, in their eyes, my overreaction. If she made me the punchline at school or spread personal details around, my mom waved it away with, "You're just too sensitive." Anytime I tried to defend myself, the response was, "She's just teasing, you need to toughen up." The pattern never broke. Their consistent defense of her chipped at me until I started to question whether what I remembered actually matched what happened. That's the dangerous side of gaslighting. It doesn't just deny your story, it makes you doubt your own perception. Sometimes their excuses were so hollow they bordered on insulting. When Alicia stole my boyfriend, what I felt was obvious and undeniable. Anger, betrayal, loss. Instead of validating that, my mom leaned back, shrugged, and delivered her version of comfort. "Maybe he wasn't right for you? Maybe he and your sister will be happier together." She skipped right past my heartbreak and redirected the spotlight onto Alicia again, as if my pain was a side issue. Later, when I overheard her telling a relative that I over-dramatized things, I felt that familiar slide of reality being rewritten. It wasn't just that I'd been hurt, it was being told, flat out, that being hurt at all meant I was flawed. Once, in the rare moment I thought Dad might be different, he shut it down before it began. After I tried explaining how Alicia mocked my grades in front of relatives, he didn't laugh this time, but instead he said, "Everyone was laughing with you, not at you." That sentence landed like a trapdoor. yanking the floor out from under me. No one had laughed with me. I hadn't told the joke, I hadn't invited the laughter. But in his version, the sting I felt wasn't humiliation, it was misinterpretation. And if I was wrong about even that, how could I trust what I felt about anything else? The favoritism slipped into daily life too, in ways that made it impossible to ignore. If Alicia skipped chores, Mom excused her as busy with school. If I did the same thing, it was framed as laziness. If she snapped, she was passionate. If I raised my voice, I had an attitude problem. My sister was graded on a generous curve, while every misstep of mine felt amplified. Those double standards weren't small. They stacked up until they felt structural, built into how our family functioned. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't the bullying itself. It was how my parents wrapped it in layers of denial and excuse. When teachers or relatives might have noticed, Mom would smooth over the mess with her usual line, "That's just normal sibling rivalry." To her, being the object of years of humiliation was no different than arguing about who got the front seat. Rivalry suggests competition. What I lived with was someone who treated me like material for a never-ending routine. But in her family spin, Alicia's actions became natural, harmless, not worth acknowledging. And in turn, I became the problem child, too reactive, too thin-skinned, too dramatic. Gaslighting works because it doesn't just shut you down on the spot. It worms its way into your head later. As a teenager, I'd lie in bed after arguments, replaying what happened, wondering if I really did blow it out of proportion. Maybe Mom was right, maybe I was overly dramatic. But the next morning, something outside the house would snap me back to reality. A classmate shouting the nickname Alicia invented. A group repeating the joke she'd rehearsed at dinner. If it was all in my head, why did everyone else seem to know her material? Those moments were grounding, but they also highlighted just how surreal things had become at home. Even the way they handled money carried the same imbalance. Alicia once borrowed a large sum from my parents and never repaid it. It didn't raise an eyebrow. Months later, I asked for $20 to buy groceries, and suddenly I was irresponsible. They said it with conviction too, as though the hypocrisy wasn't glaring. To them, her mistakes became quirks, mine became character flaws. After enough of these moments, I stopped expecting fairness at all. The where of it all went beyond frustration. It shaped how I saw myself. Being told repeatedly that your memories don't add up, or that your emotional reactions don't measure up, is exhausting. It made me quiet in ways I didn't notice then. I'd second-guess my words before saying anything at all, worried I'd be labeled sensitive again. What gaslighting does best is shrink you until you question whether you're capable of reading reality correctly. And that alone chews away at your ability to feel stable in your own skin. What stung most wasn't only their defense of her, it was how little room there was for my side. Once, when I confided in a relative, the feedback somehow reached my mom. Instead of seeing it as me reaching out in desperation, she accused me of trying to ruin the family image. That tipped me off to something bigger. It wasn't only about excusing Alicia anymore, it was about protecting the family's mask. Any truth that didn't flatter my sister or my parents was unwelcome, even if it came at the cost of my own sense of worth. By the time I was old enough to notice the patterns clearly, I understood the unwritten rules. My sister was the spotless favorite, and keeping her untarnished mattered more than anything I felt. The system wasn't broken, it was built that way. My pain didn't factor in, because validating it threatened the version of family they wanted to believe in. They stayed loyal to that version, no matter how much it asked me to shrink myself into silence. I spent years hoping that one day maybe the defense would crack. Maybe one parent would say to me, "You're right, what she did wasn't okay." But that moment never came. What came instead was a string of denials, dismissals, and carefully crafted explanations designed to overwrite my memories. When I realized that wasn't accidental, that it was deliberate, habitual, it shifted something inside me. Gaslighting had taught me to wait for fairness that wasn't coming, and waiting began to wear me down more than the problem itself ever did. Cutting ties and finding peace. Walking away wasn't about giving up, it was about survival. After years of being pushed aside, mocked, and told my feelings didn't matter, I finally saw the pattern for what it was. The betrayal with my boyfriend only confirmed what I had been denying for too long. This family would always choose her over me. Staying meant more of the same, and I couldn't keep volunteering for it. That's what pushed me to make the hardest but clearest decision of my life. I cut ties. It wasn't dramatic or loud. There were no slammed doors or screaming matches. It happened in silence, through small choices that began to stack up. At first, I stopped replying to calls. The group texts went from muted to ignored. Birthdays and holidays passed without me attending. It was a slow fade, not a sudden disappearance, but each step made it easier to breathe. After a while, the thought of sharing a dinner table with them felt impossible. Breaking away didn't feel reckless. It felt necessary, like finally removing myself from a fire I had been standing in for years. The guilt crept in at first. We're taught that family is sacred, that no matter what happens, you stick it out because blood is thicker than water. But living through my version of family flipped that idea on its head. What I learned is that blood doesn't guarantee safety. It doesn't guarantee loyalty. Sometimes it just ties you to people who cause more damage than anyone else could. Once I accepted that, the guilt began to loosen its grip. The act of cutting contact had its own strange rhythm. Blocking contacts felt monumental in the moment, but afterward, it felt more like relief. There's this pause before you do it, a flicker of hesitation. But once it's done, it's like deleting a program that's been slowing down everything else. My sister's number vanished, and the petty jabs and smug texts went with it. My mother's long messages pressuring me to give Alicia another chance stopped lighting up my screen. Even my dad's short, one-sentence replies, dismissive reminders of how little weight my feelings carried, disappeared. What I felt wasn't emptiness, but peace. Those first few weeks without them were disorienting. For so long, even negative communication had been part of the rhythm of my days. Without it, the quiet felt strange. I thought regret might hit hard, that I'd wake up one morning desperate to call them again. But what I felt instead was space. Space on my phone. Space in my head. For the first time, the day wasn't scripted around dodging insults or waiting for the next guilt trip. Into that space, I started to rebuild. I reconnected with friends I had unintentionally pushed aside whenever family obligations pulled me back into the cycle. Without the constant pressure of being judged, those conversations felt different. People listened. They didn't twist my stories into ammunition. They didn't treat me like a supporting character in my own life. For once, I belonged without being a punchline. That shift changed everything. Life got lighter in ways I hadn't expected. Hanging out with people didn't leave me bracing for impact. Phone calls became something I looked forward to, instead of something I prepared defenses for. Even day-to-day routines felt new. I could wear what I wanted without waiting for commentary. I could try new hobbies or share ideas without hearing them reduced to jokes. It was like stepping in front of a mirror for the first time and seeing a clear reflection instead of one warped for someone else's entertainment. Then came the almost comical confirmation that leaving was the right choice. A distant relative casually mentioned that Alicia had married my ex. The same boyfriend she'd stolen behind my back was now her husband. When I heard it, I laughed. But this time, it wasn't bitter. It was validation. This was the path I had avoided, being dragged into more chaos disguised as loyalty and family. Instead, I had given myself distance. Seeing that outcome only reinforced my decision to stay gone. Sometimes people ask if I'd forgive them if they apologized. The truth? Maybe. But the bigger truth is that I stopped holding on to that possibility. Waiting for them to change was its own trap, one that kept me tethered far longer than it should have. The closest I ever got to real acknowledgement was the same tired line, "Don't take it so seriously." Those weren't apologies. They were reminders that they never really saw the problem in the first place. When I cut ties, I also cut off the hope that one day they'd wake up and see what I'd lived through. And letting go of that hope was more healing than I could have imagined. What I gained wasn't just distance. It was independence. Without their commentary running in the background, I started to draw clear lines for the rest of my life too. I realized boundaries weren't just for toxic families, they were for everyone. Friendships stopped feeling like auditions. Relationships no longer felt like contests for worth. I could choose who I wanted to trust, who I wanted to keep close, based on how they treated me, not based on obligation. That control stretched into bigger things. My career, my living space, even how I pictured my future. Those were choices I couldn't make before, not when every move felt undermined. Looking back, it almost feels strange that I ever thought an apology was the key. What I needed all along wasn't recognition, it was freedom. Walking away offered something reconciliation never could, the chance to build a life where I was the one writing the script. I didn't just sever ties, I stepped into a version of myself no longer reduced to an afterthought. That was the kind of peace I hadn't thought possible, but once it arrived, I knew I would never trade it back. For years, I believed peace was something my family would eventually hand me if I just endured long enough, but it turns out peace isn't given, it's claimed. I claimed mine the day I walked away. The silence that followed wasn't sad or empty, it was proof that I had finally shifted the story in my own favor. I thought that was where the story ended. For the first time, life felt untangled and truly my own. But even after years of distance, families have a way of finding cracks in the wall you build. Just when I had settled into that peace, an email arrived in my inbox with one subject line I couldn't ignore: family emergency. The emergency family email. The message itself was direct. My sister's kidneys were shutting down, and doctors had told my family she needed a transplant as soon as possible. Dialysis and treatments hadn't been enough. They weren't talking about a plan for the future. They were talking about right now. Living relatives stood the best chance of being a match, and my mother made it clear in her email that everyone should step forward to get tested. But the weight of the words was aimed straight at me. I stared at the screen, trying to process. It was only a few lines long, but the silence that followed those sentences carried years of history. The urgency leapt off the page, but so did the expectation. My mom didn't have to write my name for it to feel spelled out in bold. It was always me. I was the daughter who kept things together. I was the one less complicated to lean on. And now, my body itself had been pulled into their story. Whether I wanted it or not, the shock came in waves. First, the disbelief. After years of here I was being pulled back by an email, by something happening inside the one person I had fought so hard to live without. Then, the irony. Alicia had taken every opportunity to cut me down, to humiliate me, to claim whatever I cared about as her own. And suddenly, the family expected the one thing she couldn't grab herself, my kidney. It felt almost surreal, like some cruel twist designed to test how much I was willing to sacrifice just because we shared DNA. And yet, as much as the resentment stabbed at the surface, guilt slid in behind it. Not the kind of guilt you can reason with, but the kind that presses into your ribs, whether you resist or not. The simple, brutal fact was this: if I didn't step forward, she might not survive. If she didn't, blame would cling to me forever. Not just from my mother or her husband, but from relatives barely present in my life. It wouldn't matter what had happened between us or who she had been to me. The truth of her illness would outweigh the truth of our history in their eyes. I didn't know if I hated that more than the alternative, that helping her would prove them right, that deep down I still owed her something after all. Both choices left me with a story I didn't want to live in. Within hours, my phone started buzzing. My mother was first, her voice soft in a way I recognized. Not gentle, but practiced. "You don't have to decide right now," she told me. "And even if you're tested, you still have the choice." I could hear the script behind her tone. It was the prelude to guilt, the warning that she already had a list of debts ready to recite. She wanted to sound calm, but she lingered on words like obligation and family just long enough for me to hear what wasn't said. Then came my grandparents, the ones who had usually been on my side. Their voices carried a different weight, hope, careful but undeniable. "It can't hurt to get tested," they said. On the surface, it sounded like kindness, but it was a softened version of pressure, because we all knew what the next step would be. If I agreed to testing, the line between choice and duty would shrink fast. Numbers on a piece of paper would tie me to decisions I wasn't ready to consider. Declining later would carry a sharper sting than refusing now. The cycle was familiar. Someone asks in calm tones, insists I still have agency, and layers it with the implication that good daughters, good family members, step up. The language was covered in velvet, but the box underneath was iron. I couldn't stop my brain from clashing with itself. One part of me reeled with old anger, remembering nights at the dinner table when she turned me into a punchline, or the day I lost Will to her smirk and lies. That girl, the one who relished cruelty, was still living in my memory. How could I sit in a doctor's office helping her now as though none of that mattered? But the other part of me ran colder. The vision of her in a hospital bed, the doctors waiting, my mother pleading. The possibility of standing by and letting it happen was its own unbearable weight. The crossroads was brutal. Agreeing meant cutting a piece of myself for someone who had never treated me as human. Refusing meant cementing the family story that I was cold, ungrateful, and selfish. Neither option felt like survival, not really. That's the twisted part about a situation like this. You can't just measure it by morality. It's because survival doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. For her, survival was tied to treatments and kidneys. For me, it was tied to whether I could keep living with the choices I made. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had once thought deleting phone numbers and blocking contacts was the height of freedom, tiny acts that finally took my family out of my daily life. Now no wall, no distance, no silence could stop their expectation from finding me. It had always been that way. When it seemed like my role in the family drama was finally over, it was written back in by something as uncontrollable as an organ failing. So I sat there, the blue glow of the laptop on my face, knowing the answer wasn't about what she deserved. If the scale was only about the past, her betrayals, her cruelty, the question wouldn't even exist. Of course she didn't deserve it, but the real weight wasn't her. It was me. Could I bear being the person who walked away, even for reasons that were justified? Could I carry the lifelong echo of refusing the one thing my family might never forgive? The email was short, but the spiral it caused wasn't. Every line replayed in my head like a drumbeat, refusing to let me step back into the peace I had created. For all the measures I'd taken to carve distance, I couldn't make this one small, typed message disappear. It had already cracked the version of freedom I believed I'd secured. And as the calls kept coming, conversation after conversation dripping with pressure masked as kindness, I realized this wasn't the kind of request you could shake off with silence. They were going to keep coming back, tugging at the guilt until it stretched raw, and I hadn't even agreed to the test yet. That was only the beginning. The pressure cooker of family guilt. The pressure didn't just trickle in, it came from every direction at once. Calls, texts, relatives dropping by unannounced, all carrying the same demand wrapped in different packaging. The message was relentless. Don't stall, don't think, just agree to help. Family unity was suddenly measured entirely by my willingness to hand over part of myself. My mom became the ringleader. Almost every conversation with her cycled through tears, anger, and guilt trips, as though she was covering all possible strategies until something stuck. One call started with her voice trembling as she spoke about Alicia's children, how they needed their mother. I actually felt that part, because kids losing a parent is tragic. But then she twisted it. Her tone sharpened, and she said words that froze me mid-breath. Your life isn't worth much anyway. You don't have kids. I gripped the phone in silence. Stunned she could frame my existence as less valuable simply because I hadn't lived my life the way she expected. My chest tightened in a mix of anger and disbelief. Even if she didn't mean to destroy me with that sentence, it landed with full force. My worth measured against my sister's children, that was the scale she chose. Then came my father's version, quieter but cutting in its own way. He liked to act like he was stepping in as the voice of reason. No raised voice, no cruel digs, just a steady, calm plea. He told me that if I didn't at least get tested, I might regret it for the rest of my life. It's about peace of mind, he said, as if that phrase could make the decision clean. He wanted me to believe that agreeing was simple responsibility, nothing more. But I heard what sat beneath the soft words. If she died, and I hadn't been tested, I'd carry not just my own grief, but the blame of the entire family. His calmness wasn't comforting, it was a warning dressed as compassion. Even my grandparents, who usually gave me space, added to the weight. They weren't pushy, not in the same way. They spoke gently, telling me it can't hurt just to get tested. They framed it like information gathering, harmless, painless, no commitment. But beneath their reassurance, I felt the trap waiting. Because if I did test, and worse, if I turned out to be a match, that supposed choice would tighten into something impossible to refuse. Their well-intentioned encouragement added an extra layer of guilt, because letting them down hurt differently. They weren't manipulative the way my parents were. They were hopeful. And the thought of disappointing them, even indirectly, pressed against me just as hard. Every conversation blurred into the same refrain. My phone felt like it belonged to them, not me. Cousins, aunts, even relatives I hadn't spoken to in years inserted themselves, repeating versions of the same rehearsed lines. You'll regret it if you don't. It's family. Think about Alicia's children. It stopped sounding like love and started sounding like a chorus of reminders that I existed for one function only: to solve this crisis. What never surfaced in any of these calls was acknowledgement of my history with Alicia. No one asked how I felt or remembered the years she spent undermining me, humiliating me, and stealing pieces of my life. None of it existed in their equation. The only math they saw was one sister dying plus one sister healthy equals an obvious solution. My mother's words about my life lacking worth drove that equation home. In their eyes, I wasn't a whole person with scars and autonomy. I was spare parts. As the pressure built, I started talking less, dodging questions by slipping into vague replies like, "I'll think about it." But hesitation only convinced them that I was edging closer to yes. To them, doubt wasn't resistance. It was progress. Every pause in answering became an opening for them to push harder, confident I was slowly folding. The longer it went on, the more it felt like I was standing in a narrowing hallway with no exits left. Eventually, I agreed to be tested. But not because I wanted to, and not because I believed it was fair. I did it tactically. I told myself that if I went through with it, everyone might back off long enough for me to breathe. The grandparents' voices echoed in my mind. It can't hurt. I clung to that as justification, even though I knew it wasn't true. I also held on to one fragile hope that the lab results would side with me. If I wasn't a match, science itself could slam the door my family kept trying to pry open. That thought kept me steady enough to say yes. But saying yes didn't feel like victory. It felt like signing a contract I didn't trust, one where the terms were hidden in fine print. Testing wasn't neutral. It was the first step into a trap. If my blood work ruled me out, relief might finally settle in. If it didn't, a new storm would start, wave after wave of pleading, manipulation, and cruel reminders of what they thought I owed. Agreeing quieted the pressure for a moment, but inside, the tension only shifted shape. While I waited for the appointment and the results that followed, the weight turned inward. It was no longer the barrage of family voices filling my days, but the quiet dread of what those tests might reveal. I wanted to believe this was the exit I had been searching for. That no matter how much moral arithmetic my parents tried to force on me, the numbers from the lab would be final. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the outcome wasn't in their hands or mine. It was in biology's. When the test was finally over and the samples sent off, the silence afterward felt fragile, almost brittle. For once, my phone stayed quiet. No buzzing, no reminders, no sudden visits. But the stillness didn't bring peace. It was the kind of quiet where you wait for a verdict, knowing that whatever shows up on paper will swing your world in one direction or the other. The days became slower, heavy with anticipation. And then the results arrived. A plain envelope, thin enough to be unremarkable, but heavy enough that I stared at it for longer than I'd like to admit. I thought I was ready. My rational mind told me it was just paperwork, but my stomach knew better. This wasn't going to read like routine lab numbers. This was about to open a door I hadn't realized was in front of me at all. Unexpected lab results. When the results finally landed in my hands, I couldn't bring myself to open them right away. My palms were damp, and the edges of the envelope bent slightly under my grip. I kept telling myself it was only numbers, just plain information from a lab, nothing personal. But I knew better. A single line on thin paper carried the power to dictate my next chapter. For weeks, I had tried to prepare for two possible outcomes. Either I was a kidney match, or I wasn't. Every scenario I imagined branched from those two words, yes or no. So when my eyes hit the first page, I scanned quickly. My stomach knotted so tightly I felt sick. My gaze locked on the line that mattered most. I wasn't a match. The rush of air left my chest so suddenly that it almost hurt. My body sagged into the chair as if the paper itself had lifted a weight off me. For the first time in months, I felt something close to freedom. I wouldn't have to lie awake, replaying arguments, rehearsing rejections, or bracing for new guilt-laden calls. Biology had spoken for me. No amount of pleading or moral lectures could argue back against medical incompatibility. Relief filled the room like oxygen returning after being trapped underwater. I actually laughed. Not a big laugh, just a small, sharp burst that sounded more like disbelief than humor. I thought, for one nourishing moment, that this chapter had closed, that I could hold up this paper like a shield and say, it isn't my choice to make. The science decided. It felt final. It felt like fairness at last. But then my eyes slid down the page. I expected heavy medical jargon, maybe blood type codes I hardly understood, or a technical wrap-up at the bottom. Instead, a sentence stopped me dead. Words that didn't belong in the script I had rehearsed appeared in clinical black and white. Significant mismatches in parental DNA markers. I read it once, twice, 3 times. My fingers tightened around the page until it crumpled slightly. I forced myself to reread every word, hoping I had misunderstood. But the meaning was unavoidable. The lab was stating, flatly, that my DNA didn't align with my father's. He wasn't my biological dad. The first jolt of relief, the joy of not being a match, collapsed under the weight of something far bigger. In seconds, kidney donation became the background story. The real revelation cut deeper than any scalpel could. I had gone into this process fearing surgery. What I got instead was proof that the man I grew up calling dad wasn't my dad in the most literal sense. Shock isn't even the right word. It was numbness, a kind that spread like cold water through my veins. One line of lab commentary rearranged decades of family memories. How could something so monumental sit on the same sheets as routine health markers? I stared at it in disbelief. This was supposed to be about Alicia's kidneys, not my entire identity. Humor flickered up in self-defense. It was absurd. I had braced myself for one kind of disaster, and instead found a completely unrelated landmine. Like expecting a pop quiz and being handed evidence that your life has been misfiled since the beginning. It was almost laughable in its cruelty. Almost. Then clarity sharpened. Memories started reassembling with a new undertone. The distance I had always felt with my father, the indifference when I tried to explain how Alicia hurt me, the way I seemed easier to dismiss. It all aligned differently now. Maybe he hadn't consciously known, but on some level, something felt off to him. My existence didn't carry the same tether biology had given him with Alicia. The thought churned until it made me physically uneasy. Did my mom know? She had to. She had held this inside for years, burying it under polished dinners and carefully crafted excuses. Was Alicia aware? Did the girl who tormented me for so long also hold the secret that I wasn't really part of the same bloodline? If she did, it would add a vicious new layer to everything I endured. The thought hollowed me out. I sat there gripping the papers, flipping the pages back and forth as if the act itself could change what I saw. Each time, the sentences refused to bend. Not compatible for donation. Significant parental mismatches. Confirmation that the foundation of my family story was not what I thought. What had seemed like endless evidence of being the odd one out wasn't just emotional. It was genetic. That realization gave a grim kind of explanation for all the double standards, all the dismissals. The favoritism that tilted toward Alicia wasn't simply cruelty. It may have been, in some quiet sense, biology pulling them more toward her than toward me. The worst part was how it made everything click so neatly into place. For years, I had carried the weight of wondering if I was too dramatic, too reactive, too different. Suddenly, the answer wasn't in my imagination. It sat printed in a lab's polite, clinical language. As clarity settled in, questions pushed forward like an unstoppable tide. Who was my biological father? Why had no one told me? How long had my mother been living 2 parallel stories? One constructed version for everyone around her and one buried at her core. And if she had hidden something this enormous, what else had been disguised as normal in our household? Relief at escaping surgery still pulsed faintly, but now it felt muted, overshadowed by confusion and betrayal. I set the paper down, then picked it back up again, afraid to even let it leave my hands, as if losing sight of it would make me doubt my own eyes. Part of me wanted to laugh again at the twisted comedy of it all. A test meant to resolve Alicia's crisis had split open a secret that explained my own. But the humor didn't last. The reality was too heavy. What frightened me most in that moment wasn't just the truth about myself. It was what would happen once the family saw this same page. My parents had been so busy coaching me to act as the dutiful daughter, the reliable donor. What would they say when the tests announced that my father wasn't my father? What excuses would rise up when the secret they had managed to protect for decades spilled out in black ink that no spin could erase? That paper had already rewritten how I saw my past. I knew the next step would be watching it rewrite the present, the fragile balance in our household, and every loyalty we thought was intact. And even before any confrontation took place, I understood something unavoidable. Whatever storm this revelation was about to unleash, there was no way to go back to how things were before. The quiet was gone. The lines had already been drawn. Pressure over kidneys had been one crisis. This new truth promised something far more explosive. And though I wasn't ready for it, I could already feel the walls of our family bending under the weight of what the test had revealed. The paternity plot twist. When the DNA report was finally shared, the kitchen became the center of impact. My dad sat at the table, motionless, staring at the page. He wasn't yelling, slamming fists, or demanding answers, just silent. That silence felt heavier than any outburst could have. His expression had drained. It wasn't rage, it was emptiness. For as long as I could remember, this was the man who believed stability defined him. Roof over our heads, steady paycheck, predictable routines. But now, the foundation he built was ripped out with one line of text. The child he raised wasn't biologically his. I watched him blink slowly, shake his head lightly, as if sheer disbelief might bend reality back to the way it used to be. My mom, on the other hand, reacted like she'd been caught unprepared in the middle of a staged performance. She snatched up the papers as though covering them could erase the evidence. Her first move wasn't regret or confession. It was denial. She insisted the test must be wrong, that labs sometimes mixed results, maybe even implying we should all pretend it hadn't happened. Her tone carried a practiced calmness, almost the same flat tone she used when chopping onions for dinner, as if over-control could carry her through. As the silence turned to stares, she scrambled further, casting blame on errors or unreliable science. The words spilled out thin and unconvincing, like an actor reading from a bad script. My dad eventually looked at her, waiting. When he finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He asked a single hard question: how? She faltered then, because denial could only carry so far. In that moment, the weight of the truth shifted. For everyone else in the room, this wasn't about medical results anymore. It was about decades of choices collapsing all at once. The truth spilled outward quickly. Relatives learned within days, and the reaction fractured along predictable lines. My dad's side of the family, his parents, siblings, cousins, erupted with anger. To them, this wasn't only about him. It was a betrayal that slashed through the lineage itself. My paternal grandparents especially demanded answers, pressing my mother with calls and visits, demanding that she finally own up to what she had done. They framed it as not just betrayal of a husband, but betrayal of a family legacy, a stain on the name they had nurtured for generations. My mom's family, on the other hand, didn't deny what happened, but their response carried thick embarrassment. They looked at me with pity, avoided conversation, acted as though my mom's history had become theirs to atone for. At the next holiday gathering, it was obvious how deep the divide had become. People sat on opposite couches, conversations fragmented in corners, food untouched on plates. No matter how many times someone tried to redirect the subject, it circled back to the same wound, the paternity truth, sitting between us all. Watching from the middle, my own memories rearranged themselves. All the years of favoritism climbing toward my sister, the endless dismissals when I asked for backing, the way my father's affection often felt thinner toward me. I had attributed it to poor parenting, to character flaws. Now I saw another layer. Whether conscious or not, he must have felt something different toward me. And my mom may have overprotected Alicia because she was the child who fit within the image. The pattern wasn't random cruelty. It had roots in biology no one had admitted existed. And under pressure, my mom finally broke her facade enough to admit what she had buried. She confessed she'd had an affair with her personal trainer around the time I was conceived. She had ended it quickly afterward, convinced it would never follow her, convinced secrecy was safer than honesty. That single decision had shaped decades of how our family operated, built on the lie that this would stay hidden forever. Saying it aloud didn't undo the damage. It only confirmed the scope of what she had chosen to protect. My dad carried that revelation like a fresh wound. At first it was shock, but it shifted into slow collapse. He grew quieter. Dinner conversations dried up into silence. Nights stretched into absences, unexplained and unspoken. His body seemed to shrink too, clothes hanging looser, his jawline more severe. I would catch him glancing in my direction with pain that wasn't about me, but had everything to do with what I represented, the reminder of betrayal. I hadn't asked for it, but in his eyes, I carried the imprint of the affair. It cracked something between us that couldn't be patched. Eventually, he took a step that ended decades of shared life. He moved toward divorce, unable to maintain a marriage reshaped by deceit. Meanwhile, the effect on me spread into every corner. Relatives looked at me differently, some soft with pity, others sharp with suspicion, a few whispering with the air of detectives chasing scandal. The family gossip spun into rumors about who my biological father was, speculation that twisted my very identity into dinner table material. Once again, I was reduced to entertainment, but this time on a larger stage. I had gone from child scapegoat to family mystery, and neither role allowed me to simply be myself. Yet in the midst of this rupture, clarity anchored itself. For years, I had doubted my perceptions, told myself maybe I was reading things wrong. But now the favoritism and the alienation had context. It wasn't random at all. Alicia was the daughter who made sense on paper, safe within the narrative. I was the contradiction my mother had tried to bury, the reason she bent rules and gaslit truth. The lie that shaped my childhood hadn't been my imagination. It had been strategy. My mom continued to perform denial even after confession. She minimized, downplayed, urged us to drop it, and focus instead on Alicia's health. She insisted that family wasn't about genetics, which might have felt noble if she hadn't let biology define every boundary and comparison for decades. The hypocrisy cut deepest. Denial may have shielded her public image, but it left those around her carrying the real burden of fractured trust. My dad's unraveling and eventual decision to walk away made it impossible to ignore just how much damage had reached the core. Watching his pain cemented the truth. This wasn't only my betrayal to live with, it was his marriage, his identity as a father, his family name unraveled. The fracture wasn't isolated. It ran in every direction at once. For me personally, the paternity twist was equal parts devastation and explanation. Devastation because it shook how I saw myself and shattered what little foundation of family I thought remained. Explanation because it finally revealed why I had always been treated differently, why loyalty always tilted toward Alicia, and why my attempts to fit in had always failed. It proved in writing that my story hadn't been exaggerated or invented. It had been shaped by a lie carried for decades. And as the truth hung in the air, the cracks in our household widened into canyons. No denial, no performance, no polite gathering could stitch the pieces back together. What followed was not just fallout, it was a complete shift in how every person in the family moved around each other, with sympathy, anger, or shame choosing sides. My place within that landscape was about to change too, not because I did anything, but because one test had redrawn the lines of who we really were, the fallout and new perspective. When the DNA fallout rippled outward, everything inside the house and far beyond it began to fracture. My dad unraveled in plain sight, not with shouting, but with the long, tired silence of someone realizing the ground beneath him had never been stable at all. Nights where he once came home early turned into nights where he never came home at all. When he was there, he paced for hours, hallway to living room, back again, like a man searching for proof that the walls had always been real. It wasn't anger that startled me most, but the cracks in his voice, the way he couldn't seem to finish a sentence anymore. The test hadn't only dismantled my identity, it had dismantled the marriage he thought he'd built his life on. My mom tried at first to hold the wall of denial sturdy enough to convince people she still controlled the story. But once extended family learned what the test showed, the weight of it spread quickly. My dad's side didn't waste time whispering. They called, visited, confronted. My grandparents on his side, normally reserved and careful, were furious. They demanded explanations, outright pressed her for accountability. Nothing she offered, denials, claims of lab error, or half-constructed excuses, was enough. The disbelief hardened into anger, and anger hardened into a kind of rejection. Family members who once brushed off her behavior now wouldn't even let her frame the narrative. Even her own relatives, who usually softened her edges and offered excuses she didn't deserve, changed their tune. My maternal grandparents, often the first to defend her, regardless of the situation, couldn't defend this. They carried themselves with visible shame, not around me, but around her. It was new for me to look at them and see embarrassment rather than blind loyalty. Soon, gatherings shifted. Chairs angled away from her, eyes dropped when her name came up, phone calls shortened to polite formalities. The isolation wasn't subtle. It wrapped her entire presence in silence. The sympathy I had never received suddenly reached me. Relatives who once told me to toughen up were now calling, sending messages, checking in. They asked how I was holding up, if I needed anything, if I wanted to talk. Some of it was genuine, I think, but most of it felt more like attempts at clearing their conscience. For years I had been the forgotten one, overlooked, dismissed out of convenience. Now, because the truth had confirmed what I'd always known, eyes turned soft when they met mine. I didn't reject it, but I didn't welcome it either. Those messages didn't undo the years of silence when I was still the one carrying all the weight without support. In the center of it all, my mom finally faced consequences that were impossible to spin away. My dad filed for divorce. She moved out, pushed to stay with her relatives, where even sympathy was scarce. The network she had once leaned on had collapsed entirely. Without her marriage, without extended family ready to defend her, she stood alone. And for someone who built a life on perception and control, being left without an audience was its own punishment. For my dad, the devastation never really passed, but his shift was clear. He stopped defending her. He stopped explaining her absences, stopped trying to hold the family narrative together. He treated her differently, not in anger, but in the absence of attention. What once revolved around her now loosened, quietly drifting out of orbit. Watching their marriage disintegrate taught me a lot about fragility, about how a single truth can undo decades of carefully rehearsed lies. Some nights when I stepped back from the uproar, all I could process was the irony. The only reason this secret had surfaced was because my mom pressured me to take a kidney test. A test meant to save her perfect daughter had detonated the lie she thought she'd managed to bury. She brought it onto herself, even if she couldn't admit it. That irony carried a dark satisfaction for me. For once, I didn't have to argue my perspective or beg to be believed. The truth sat on paper, undeniable, holding every lie accountable without me having to do a thing. Even Alicia was shaken. I expected her to twist it somehow, to turn the spotlight and redirect the uproar onto me. Instead, she seemed stunned into honesty. She admitted she hadn't known about my mother's affair. And in that quiet, almost reluctant way, she apologized to me for the cruelty that had defined our childhood. The words didn't erase years of wounds, but they landed in a way I never thought they would. For the first time, she wasn't the girl laughing at my expense. She was just a sister acknowledging harm. Oddly, I didn't feel bitterness anymore. The apology closed something I'd been carrying, and for the first time, I hoped she found her own peace. She did eventually get the transplant too, matched and saved by another donor. Knowing she survived without me left me strangely relieved. What once would have tethered us in guilt no longer existed. We both had the chance to move forward, separately, but lighter. As for me, the test stripped away the illusion I grew up under, but it also gave me clarity no apology could provide. I finally stopped chasing the pieces of a family connection that had never really been offered. My mother refused to give me my biological father's name, and after trying and getting nowhere, I made the deliberate choice to stop looking. I didn't need him to patch something or fill a void. I learned I didn't need that piece of information to feel whole. The answers I carried already gave me enough. In time, my life grew outside of the shadow of all of this. I built stability, relationships that held instead of bent, a home where laughter wasn't barbed or mocking. I married a man who saw me for myself, not as some reflection of a family rivalry. With him, I built something I had never experienced before: love without competition, trust without conditions. That became enough, more than enough, to define the rest of my story. Looking back, I realized the real shift came not from a test result, but from the understanding it forced into light. The lies collapsed, and with them collapsed every excuse that had once left me questioning my own memory or self-worth. It gave me, finally, the freedom to stop tying my value to a family that had never handled it with care in the first place. And although the fallout had been devastating for everyone, my perspective had changed. I no longer saw myself as the overlooked sibling or the scapegoat or the dramatic one. I saw myself as someone who had lived through the fracture of a family, survived it, and stepped beyond its weight. That shift didn't come from reconciliation. It came from truth, carving out space for something new. In the end, what the test revealed was less about biology and more about exposure. Lies don't stay buried, not forever. And when they surface, they rewrite everything, not just relationships, but what you think of belonging itself. My family had been broken long before the envelope arrived, but now the cracks were visible to everyone. And as those cracks widened, it pushed me towards something I hadn't thought possible: perspective that finally gave me peace. It's strange how a single test, a test I only took to quiet the noise, ended up reshaping every part of my story. What began as pressure for a kidney ended as proof of how fragile family ties can be when built on secrets. And what I carried forward wasn't organs or obligation. It was the clarity of knowing what was real all along. In the end, the test didn't just measure medical compatibility. It revealed how deeply my family had been incompatible all along. What began as pressure to save my sister's life exposed fractures that had been hidden for decades. And the only real cure I found was stepping away to protect my own peace. If you've ever faced surprising family revelations or pressure to sacrifice more than you could give, I'd like to hear how you handled it. Share your experience in the comments. And if you connected with this story, remember to like and subscribe for more. Just a warning, with DNA kits, the results don't always come back with only science. In my case, the drama was included.